The first Valentine's Day after Emily's death was supposed to be quiet. I had planned to spend the night alone, maybe have a drink, and let the memories drift in and out. But when I came home from work that evening, there was a small red envelope waiting on the kitchen table. I lived alone. The doors had been locked when I left. The windows were shut. Yet, there it was. The envelope was smooth, unmarked, except for my name, written in familiar handwriting, Emily's handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was an old note I had misplaced. Maybe one of her friends had found something she'd left behind and decided cruelly to leave it for me. But when I turned it over, the seal was fresh. The envelope had never been opened before. Inside, on delicate paper that smelled faintly of roses, was a message written in black ink. Happy Valentine. I miss you. I'll see you soon. I dropped the letter. My stomach twisted and my vision blurred. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. Emily had died a year ago in a car accident. I barely slept that night, my mind stuck on the impossible. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had to be a prank, though I couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. Then, on February 15th, another letter appeared. I saw you read my note. I hope it made you smile. I can't wait to be together again. That time, I ran through the entire house, checking every lock, every window, every crevice where someone could have entered. Nothing was disturbed. There was no sign of anyone breaking. I burned the letters that night. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the flames devouring the ink. But even as the last ember died out, I felt no relief. The next morning, another letter waited for me. That wasn't very nice, darling, but I forgive you. True love never burns away. I threw up in the sink. By February 17th, I stopped sleeping. By the 18th, I barely ate. Every day, a new letter arrived. The words grew more unsettling. You look tired. I wish I could hold you again. I watched you searching the house last night. You were so close. Do you remember the song we danced to on our wedding night? I played it for you while you slept. I hadn't played music in months, but that night, at exactly 3:14 a.m., soft static hummed from the old radio in the living room. Then, a crackling melody filtered through the darkness. Our song. I smashed the radio into pieces. By February 19th, the letters began mentioning things no one else should. I saw you crying at my grave. You still wear the watch I gave. It's cracked now, but you still check it every morning, just like you used to. I hadn't visited Emily's grave in months. I had never told anyone about the watch, but my hands clenched instinctively around my wrist, where the old cracked leather strap still sat. On the 20th, I didn't leave the house. I sat by the door, waiting, watching, but the letter still appeared. Come downstairs. I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed against it, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet carried me to the basement door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air was damp, heavy with an earthy, decayed scent. The single bulb flickered weakly as I descended, and then I saw it. In the center of the basement floor, the dirt had been disturbed. A shallow mound of earth, freshly turned. A half-buried box sat in the soil. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down, my shaking hands brushing away the dirt. It was Emily's old jewelry box, the one that had been buried with. The lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside, neatly stacked, were every single letter I had burned, unscorched, unharmed. And on top of the final, I found my way home, my love. I'm waiting for you downstairs. Behind me, the basement door slammed shut. I had never been one for blind dates, but after months of loneliness, my friends insisted. It's Valentine's Day, they said. You shouldn't be alone. So I agreed. The restaurant was a dimly lit place downtown, perfect for couples looking for an intimate evening. Candles flickered on each table, reflecting off polished wine glasses. The soft hum of conversation filled the air. I arrived early, nervous but hopeful. The hostess smiled warmly and led me to a small table by the window. He's already here, she said, gesturing to the man seated across from me. I paused. Something felt off. The man looked up and smiled, but the moment our eyes met, my blood ran cold. I knew him. I knew him in a way that made my stomach twist violently, in a way that made me want to run, to scream, because this wasn't a stranger. This was Daniel. Daniel, my ex-boyfriend. Daniel, who had died 3 years ago. I had seen his body. I had attended the funeral. I had watched as they lowered his coffin into the ground. Yet here he was. His face was just as I remembered. Sharp features, dark hair, the same soft dimple in his cheek when he smiled. But his eyes, something about them was wrong. Too dark, too hollow. I couldn't move. Hey, he said, as if this were normal. As if we were two old lovers meeting again after years apart. You look beautiful. My throat closed. I couldn't even speak. Sit, he said gently, motioning to the chair across from me. I've missed you. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I was lowering into the chair. My hands trembled in my lap. My voice barely came out. You're not supposed to be here. He chuckled softly, tilting his head. Why would you say that? Tears burned my eyes. My hands clenched into fists. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. Because you're dead. Silence stretched between us. Daniel stared at me for a long moment. Then he sighed, shaking his head like I had just said something foolish. Come on, he said. Don't be like that. We're together again? Isn't that what matters? A waiter appeared beside us, startling me. Good evening, the waiter said, smiling politely. Can I start you off with something to drink? Yes, I blurted out, desperate. Please, I need help. This man... I turned to point at Daniel, but the chair was empty. The candle flickered. The waiter frowned. Miss? I stared at the vacant seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I swallowed hard. He was just here. The waiter gave me a concerned look. Are you waiting for someone? I didn't answer. I just stood up on shaking legs, knocking over my chair. The entire restaurant seemed to blur around me as I stumbled toward the exit, ignoring the confused stares. Outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I gasped for breath, gripping the wall beside me. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. My hands shook as I pulled it out. One new message. I shouldn't have looked. I should have thrown the phone as far as I could and run. But I didn't. I opened it. I had a wonderful time tonight. Let's do this again soon. Attached was a photo of me, sitting across from Daniel, smiling. I never should have answered the door that night. It was Valentine's Day, and I had planned to spend it alone. No dates, no parties, just me, a bottle of wine, and a horror movie playing in the background. It had been a long year, and the last thing I wanted was to be reminded of how empty my life had become. But at exactly 11:45 p.m., there was a knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. I frowned. No one should have been visiting me this late. My friends knew better, and I hadn't ordered anything. Another knock. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the edge of the couch. Something about it felt wrong. Too quiet, too slow. I got up, heart hammering in my chest, and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood on my porch. She was pale, almost sickly so, and wore a red dress, bright, vivid, unnatural in the dim light. Her black hair fell in damp strands over her shoulders, and her lips were curved into a soft, eerie smile I didn't recognize. Can I help you? I called through the door, not daring to open it. Silence. Then she knocked again. I swallowed hard. Who are you? Her head tilted slightly as if confused by the question. Then she spoke. I have a Valentine. Her voice was strange, hollow, distant, like an echo from somewhere far away. Goosebumps prickled along my arms. I think you have the wrong house, I said, stepping back. I didn't. The knocking started again, harder more insistent. I backed away, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't. I turned off the lights, hoping she'd think I wasn't home, but the knocking only grew louder, and then a whisper, so soft I almost didn't hear it. Let me in. I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My phone trembled in my hands as I dialed 911, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But the moment the line connected, the knocking stopped. Silence. I stood frozen in the darkness, the operator's voice crackling through the speaker. 911, what's your emergency? I forced myself to move, creeping toward the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. The porch was empty. No woman. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish. Maybe it had been some weird prank. Maybe I had overreacted. Then my phone buzzed. A new message. I'm inside. The floor creaked behind me. I always hated working, but Valentine's Day made it worse. Watching happy couples fill the streets while I sat alone in my office only reminded me of how empty my life had become. That night, I was the last one in the building. The clock on my desk glowed 11:17 p.m., and I was nearly finished when I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window. I froze. My office was on the 9th floor. Slowly, I turned toward the glass, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I saw nothing but the city skyline, dark, endless, dotted with distant lights. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed it. A single red handprint. It was smeared against the outside of the window, fingers spread wide, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass and dragged it downward. A chill crawled up my spine. There was no ledge outside my window, no balcony, no possible way anyone could have reached it. I swallowed hard, trying to stay rational. Maybe it had been there earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe it was some weird prank. But then, the tapping came again. My heart slammed against my ribs. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off the glass. And that's when I saw it. A face, pale, hollow, lips stretched into a twisted smile. A woman in a red dress was clinging to the outside of my office window, her black hair whipping in the wind. I scrambled back, nearly knocking over my chair. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't look away. She was watching me. And then, impossibly, she started to move. She didn't climb. She didn't fall. She simply crawled, her body shifting in unnatural, jerking motion. as she pressed her hands and feet against the glass, moving sideways like a spider. I choked on a breath. My office door was still locked. There was no way in. But she wasn't trying to get in. She was pointing. My phone buzzed violently in my hand. I tore my gaze away from the window and looked down. A new message. No number. No name. Just 3 words. Turn around now. My body went cold. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But some unseen force compelled me, my muscles tightening as I slowly turned my head. The woman in the red dress was standing right behind me. Her lips parted, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. And then she whispered, "Happy Valentine's Day." I never believed in ghosts. I never believed in curses. But on Valentine's night, I learned that some things should never be ignored. It started with a letter. When I got home from work, an envelope lay on my doorstep. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name, scrawled in deep red ink. I hesitated, glancing up and down the hallway of my apartment building. No one was there. Curious, I picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single card. Be mine. That was it. No signature, no message. Just those 2 words written in the same dark red ink. A joke, I thought. Maybe one of my friends messing with me. I tossed the card on the kitchen counter and forgot about it. At least, I tried to forget. At midnight, my phone buzzed. A text. No number. Just the same message. Be mine. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I started typing a response, but something stopped me. A sound, a whisper. It came from the hallway outside my apartment. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. I exhaled shakily. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe scratch, scratch, scratch. My blood ran cold. The sound was right outside my door. Soft, deliberate, like fingernails dragging against the wood. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs, then knock, knock, knock. Slow, rhythmic. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I hovered over the call button, about to dial 911, when another text came. "I know you're awake." A breath hitched in my throat. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, click, the door unlocked. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. The knob twisted. I stumbled back, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, raising it like a weapon. The door creaked open an inch. Darkness pooled beyond it, thick and unnatural. The hallway light outside my apartment flickered, then died, and then I saw it. A hand, long fingers, pale and thin, curling around the edge of the door. Slowly, too slowly, it pushed the door open wider. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. A shadow stepped forward. I raised the lamp, ready to swing, and then my phone buzzed one last time. "You're mine now." The light in my apartment flickered out. I didn't expect anything for Valentine's Day. I wasn't dating anyone, hadn't been in years, and preferred it that way. So when I found a single red rose on my doorstep that morning, I was confused. No note, no explanation, just a perfect, freshly cut rose. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I brought it inside. I placed it in a glass of water, the stem cut neatly at an angle, and set it on the kitchen counter. It seemed harmless enough. A gift from a secret admirer, maybe, or a prank. I didn't know anyone who would do something like that, but I thought nothing more of it. I wasn't expecting a grand gesture, especially not on a day like Valentine's Day. The day passed uneventful. Work was the usual grind. I had a few minor tasks, followed by the usual parade of meaningless conversations, office small talk. It was nothing out of the ordinary. By the time I got home, I had nearly forgotten about the mysterious rose. My mind had drifted to other things, what I would have for dinner, a new episode of a show I had been watching, plans for the weekend. But as soon as I stepped inside my apartment, a strange scent filled the air. Roses, dozens. The fragrance was overpowering, sweet and heavy, cloying the air like a sickly perfume. I blinked, disoriented, as I scanned the room. My apartment was exactly as I had left it, except for the flowers. They covered every surface, the couch, the coffee table, the floor. Deep red petals lay scattered across the hardwood, leading a path toward my bedroom. The sight of it was overwhelming, as though the flowers had been deliberately placed, creating a trail for me to follow. The petals were so vibrant, so vivid against the polished wood of the floor, that they almost seemed unnatural. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police. But then I saw it. A note. It sat in the center of my coffee table, surrounded by a perfect circle of rose petals. The words were written in deep, smudged red ink, the letters uneven, almost erratic. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and the weight of it felt strange, heavy in my palm, like it had been there for longer than I could remember. The note read, "Do you like them? I picked them just for you." No name, no signature, just those words, written in a way that seemed too intimate, too possessive. My breath hitched. Who could have left this? How did they know where I lived? My fingers shook as I turned the note over, hoping for some kind of clue, anything that would help me make sense of it. But there was nothing, just the same message. My heart pounded. Something's very wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but before I could move, I heard it. The sound of something faint, a creaking noise from behind me. My body froze. My eyes shot to the closet door. It was slightly ajar, barely enough to see inside, but the darkness beyond it was... I didn't remember. In fact, I could have sworn I had shut it earlier. A single red petal drifted out, landing softly at my feet. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at the petal, its vivid color stark against the cold, hard floor. Then, the whisper, soft, sickening. You finally let me in. The voice was low, almost a hum, but it sent an icy shiver through me. The words dripped with malice, with something unholy. I wanted to run, to scream, to get out of my apartment and never come back. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor, my chest tightening with every breath. A shadow shifted inside the closet. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt it. It was there, watching me, waiting. The closet door inched open further, the darkness expanding as though it were alive, pulling the light from the room. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. My eyes locked on the growing gap, a chill crawling down my spine. I wanted to run. I wanted to get away, but I couldn't move. The air grew colder. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. I've been waiting so long. The closet door creaked open wider, revealing a figure standing just inside the dark space. The outline of a person too tall, too still. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel them. Their presence was suffocating, as if they were closing in on me from all sides, making it impossible to breathe. The room seemed to close in, the shadows growing thicker, pressing against me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. The figure stepped into the light, and I gasped. It wasn't a person at all, at least not completely. It was a figure wrapped in a long, tattered black cloak. Its hands were unnaturally long, the fingers too thin and too pale, with nails that looked like they belonged to something from a nightmare. The face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless mask. Not a single expression, not a single emotion. Just the emptiness, the hollowness. I could feel my blood running cold, my legs shaking beneath me. My mind raced for an explanation, for something, anything that could make sense of it. But there was nothing. There were no words for what I was seeing. It was here, in my apartment. The thing that had been leaving the roses. The thing that had been waiting for me. And then it spoke. Its voice a rasping whisper that scratched at my soul. Do you like the... I couldn't answer. My voice was gone, stolen by fear. I wanted to run, to flee, but my body refused to move. I felt like I was glued to the spot, unable to escape the terrible presence standing before me. The figure stepped closer, and I felt an icy gust of wind, as though the very air was being sucked from the room. It reached out a hand, its fingers too long, too cold, and gently brushed the side of my face. I shuddered. I've just been waiting for... Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, becoming more oppressive, suffocating. I could hear the soft rustling of petals, as though they were swirling around me, filling the room, the apartment, my mind. The smell of roses and I felt dizzy, like I was drowning in their scent. The figure stepped back, but only slightly, its presence still looming in the corner of my... Its voice came again, this time a soft, almost tender whisper. You'll never be alone again. And then, the air went still. The temperature seemed to drop, and the weight of the room shifted. I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the closet door, which now hung wide open. There was nothing there. Nothing except for the roses, everywhere. The petals, the scent, the whisper of its voice still echoing in my head. The door to my apartment slammed shut behind me with a finality I couldn't ignore. I had been marked. Valentine's Day would never be the same again. I used to love Valentine's Day. The flowers, the chocolates, the feeling of love in the air. It used to mean something. But after what happened last year, I can't even hear the date without feeling my stomach twist into knots. It started with a text. Happy Valentine's Day, beautiful. I stared at my phone, confused. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. For a brief moment, I wondered if it was an old acquaintance, someone I had forgotten about, maybe an ex, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't dated anyone seriously in years. Who is this? I typed back. No response. I shrugged it off and went about my evening. Work had been exhausting, and all I wanted to do was curl up with a book and ignore the world for the rest of the night. But just as I settled onto the couch, my phone buzzed again. I've missed you. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the message felt personal, like whoever was on the other end knew me, intimate. I should have ignored it, should have blocked the number and gone on with my... But against my better judgment, I replied, I think you have the wrong number. This time the response was instant. No, I don't. My fingers hovered over the screen, my heart beating a little faster now. I decided to call the number. The phone rang once, twice, three times. Then someone answered, but they didn't speak. The only sound on the other end was breathing, slow, deep, deliberate. An icy dread crept up my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A pause, then, in a soft whisper, "I'm right outside." My stomach dropped. I turned toward the window. My apartment was on the third floor, but I still felt the overwhelming urge to check. I pulled the curtain back, and there, standing in the glow of the street lamp, was a man. He was tall, dressed in black. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see one thing clearly. He was holding a bouquet of dead roses. The phone slipped from my hand. He tilted his head as if sensing my fear. Then, without breaking eye contact, he raised one hand and waved. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something, but then my phone buzzed again. A picture message. My breath hitched in my throat as I opened it. It was a photo of me, taken from inside my apartment, right behind me. A cold sweat broke out over my skin. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my eyes darting around the room. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like something unseen was pressing against my chest. But I was alone. At least, I thought I was. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? Was he already inside? How? I had locked the door. I was sure of it. I forced myself to move, to check the locks, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me not to turn my back. The door was still locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, that picture, it wasn't possible. My phone buzzed again. "You look even prettier when you're scared." I couldn't breathe. Something rustled behind me. I turned slowly, my heart slamming against my rib. The closet door. It was open. Just a crack. I knew it had been closed before. The air grew thick with the scent of roses, but not fresh ones. These smelled rotten, decayed, like they had been left to die in the... Another buzz. "You forgot to check the closet." The blood drained from my face. I stared at the message, willing it to be a mistake, a sick joke. A whisper slithered through the silence. "I can see you." A single dead rose petal drifted to the floor from the closet. I couldn't move. The door creaked open wider. And then, from the darkness inside, a pale hand reached out. That was the last thing I saw before the lights cut out. I never celebrated Valentine's Day. It wasn't my thing. Too commercial, too forced. I'd always dismissed it as an excuse for superficial displays of affection. A day that forced cliches upon people who were already too busy or too guarded to care. But last year, something happened that changed the way I look at February 14th forever. I had returned home late from work on that bitter winter night, the city streets empty and echoing with the sound of my solitary footsteps. The biting cold had seeped through my coat, and by the time I reached my apartment building, my body was already exhausted from the day's relentless pace. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, the sound of metal and locks clicking into place, and finally stepped into the small sanctuary of my home. The apartment was dimly lit as usual, the only light coming from a solitary lamp in the living room that cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. I tossed my coat carelessly onto the couch, not giving it a second thought as I headed to the kitchen to prepare a quick cup of tea. The routine was comforting, a small ritual to end a long day. Yet, as soon as I set down my mug on the counter, my phone buzzed, disrupting the fragile normalcy of the moment. The screen displayed a missed call from an unknown caller. I frowned, a ripple of irritation mixed with curiosity stirring within me. I rarely answered numbers I didn't recognize, usually letting them go to voicemail. But tonight, something compelled me to check the message. I tapped the voicemail icon and listened. At first, all I heard was static, a harsh, unyielding hiss that filled the quiet of my apartment. I leaned forward, straining to catch any discernible sound beneath the interference. And then, almost as if emerging from the static's white noise, came a voice. It was soft, ragged, and disturbingly intimate. "I see you." Those three words struck me like a bolt of icy lightning. A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and I froze in place. My heart pounded so hard I was sure others could hear it through the thin walls. I glanced around the room desperately. The door was locked. Every window was securely shut. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, that voice, so eerily personal, had spoken as if it had been watching me all along. I tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank or a technical anomaly, a mistake by an overzealous telemarketer, but deep down, unease had already taken root. Barely a minute later, my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before pressing play on the new voicemail. This time the voice was a little clearer, though still warped by static. The message was unsettlingly direct. "You left the door unlocked." My stomach churned and I bolted to the door, checking the deadbolt with trembling fingers. It was securely locked, exactly as I remembered fastening it when I left. Confusion warred with panic as I tried to rationalize the impossible. Had I forgotten something? Was someone playing an elaborate joke? Yet, there was no logical explanation that fit the situation. Before I could compose another thought, the phone buzzed a third time. With mounting dread, I listened to the next message. You shouldn't have ignored me. Each word reverberated in the silence of my apartment, intensifying the terror that already pulsed through my veins. I instinctively stepped back from the door, my breathing shallow and rapid, as if the very air had turned hostile. The oppressive silence that followed the message was deafening, as if the entire universe were holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Then came the sound, a soft, deliberate tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. The noise was rhythmic, measured, and it seemed to come from right outside my living room. My pulse raced as I slowly turned toward the sound. Through the frost-kissed glass of the window, I glimpsed a tall, dark shadow standing motionless against the dim glow of a street lamp. The figure was indistinct, barely more than a silhouette against the murk of the night, yet its presence was unnervingly palpable. Before I could make sense of the vision, a whisper drifted through the air, so soft it might have been imagined, yet unmistakably real. The voice, now coming from somewhere inside my apartment, spoke the final words that would haunt me forever. Happy Valentine's Day. Time seemed to slow as I stared at the window, heart pounding, every sense on high alert. The shadow outside did not move. It simply existed there, an eerie sentinel in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to call out, to demand that whoever was behind this vanish, but my voice had deserted me. I took a hesitant step forward, drawn by a mixture of fear and a desperate need for answers. I approached the window, my eyes straining to pierce the gloom beyond. The street lamp flickered intermittently, casting wavering patterns across the pavement, but the shadow remained fixed. Its presence was both unnerving and inexplicably intimate, as if it knew me personally. I pressed my hand against the cool glass, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no sign of movement behind me, only the echo of that whispered greeting that seemed to linger in the air. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity as I stood by the window, paralyzed by dread and uncertainty. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by a malicious intruder seeking to harm me, but by something far more insidious, something that blurred the line between the tangible and the unknown. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to secure myself in the safety of locked doors and familiar routines. Yet I found myself frozen, a silent witness to a horror that defied explanation. Eventually, I forced myself away from the window and retreated into the dim interior of my apartment. I tried to reassemble the fragments of my scattered thoughts. Was it possible that someone had hacked my phone? Had a friend, or worse, a stranger with a sinister sense of humor, orchestrated this elaborate hoax? Rationality offered little comfort in the face of such inexplicable occurrences. The sequence of events, the voice that claimed to see me, the message accusing me of negligence, and the final chilling greeting seemed too meticulously crafted, too personal to be mere coincidence. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the residual warmth of my now cold tea doing little to soothe the chill that had invaded my bones. I began to wonder if I should contact a friend perhaps, or even the authorities, but the rational part of my mind hesitated, conflicted by the creeping terror that any acknowledgement of this intrusion might invite further, more dangerous manifestations. As the night wore on, the oppressive silence of my apartment was punctuated only by the echo of my own labored breathing. I double-checked every lock, every window, desperate to convince myself that I was truly alone and safe. But deep within, a persistent fear gnawed at my thoughts. I couldn't help but feel that the shadow and that unseen caller had transcended the simple act of mischief. They had touched something deep, something personal, and in doing so, shattered the fragile boundaries of my normal life. Sleep was elusive that night. I lay in bed, the darkness around me filled with whispered and imagined footsteps. Every creak in the building, every rustle of the became a potential harbinger of further terror. I kept replaying the voicemail messages over and over in my mind, each repetition a reminder of the night's inexplicable events. The phrase Happy Valentine's Day echoed like a sinister mantra, its implications twisting in my thoughts. When dawn finally broke, the weak light of morning did little to dispel the lingering sense of dread. I rose with a heaviness that wasn't entirely physical, a burden of memories too unsettling to shake off with the passing of the night. My phone lay silent on the nightstand, its screen dark and unresponsive, as if mocking the fear it had instilled in me. I tried to resume my routine, to convince myself that the night was nothing more than an aberration, a cruel anomaly in an otherwise orderly life. But every time I passed the window, I couldn't help but glance outside, half expecting to see that dark silhouette waiting, watching. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to escape the memory of that. The mundane details of life, the clink of dishes in the sink, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed tainted by the whisper of a voice and the promise of something ominous lurking in the dark. I began to scrutinize every sound, every shadow, as if expecting another visitation at any moment. Friends noticed my distraction, the haunted look in my eyes, but when I tried to explain, my words came out halting and disjointed, lacking the clarity to capture the full terror of my experience. I attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a prank or a technical glitch that had coincided with my own insecurities about the day. But deep down, I knew that nothing could explain the intimate nature of the message, the personal detail that accused me of leaving my door unlocked, or the spectral presence outside my window. It was as though someone, or something, had reached through the barrier between the known and the unknown and made a connection with me, one that I could neither sever nor fully understand. Now, as the calendar inches toward the next Valentine's Day, the memory of that night is ever present. I find myself locking my doors with an extra measure of care, checking the windows multiple times before I allow myself to relax. The simple act of hearing a phone buzz fills me with dread, each ring a reminder of that voice, a voice that may be waiting in the shadows for another chance to intrude upon my solitude. I still don't know who or what reached out to me that fateful night. I haven't found any traceable clues or evidence that could explain the origin of those messages. All that remains is the unsettling certainty that something inexplicable touched my life, a reminder that even on a day celebrated for love, terror can find a way to make its mark. Every time February 14th approaches, I brace myself, heart pounding, for the possibility that the whisper might return. And until that day, I carry with me the chilling legacy of that night, a night when a simple greeting transformed my perception of safety, leaving an indelible scar on my soul. Happy Valentine. Those words continue to echo in the dark corners of my mind, a haunting refrain that reminds me that sometimes the most intimate encounters come unbidden when we least expect them, and that the shadows hold secrets we might never dare to confront. Valentine's Day had always been a night of harmless mischief for me, a chance to laugh off the loneliness with a few friends and some absurd rituals. That night, in the cramped back room of a friend's house, we gathered around a rickety table lit by a few trembling red candles. Between nervous giggles and half-hearted dares, we decided to mock the idea of cursed love. In a mix of bravado and juvenile superstition, we scrawled our names on a scrap of paper and recited an incantation meant to curse any love that dared to touch us. I laughed along, dismissing it as drunken theatrics, never imagining that our careless words would echo into my life in such a horrifying way. It began subtly. A week later, as I sat alone in my dimly lit room, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar message. The screen glowed in an eerie crimson as I read the single line, "You're next." At first, I assumed it was a cruel joke, nothing more than a prank born of our earlier foolishness. But as the days passed, a pattern emerged that I could no longer ignore. Every time I had allowed even the slightest hint of romance into my life, a fleeting text message from a secret admirer, a hopeful smile from someone I'd liked, even a casual conversation that hinted at something more, it was followed by inexplicable tragedy. I recalled Jane, my high school sweetheart, whose promising future ended in a bizarre car accident. I remembered Mark, a gentle soul who once dared to hold my hand on a chilly February evening, only to vanish in a swirl of unanswered phone calls and hushed whispers among his friends. Each death, each misfortune, was marked by one haunting refrain. In the final moments before their lives slipped away, their last words, caught on a barely audible voicemail or scribbled on a fogged mirror, always echoed the same chilling message, "You're next." At first, I tried to dismiss these horrifying coincidences. I buried myself in work and avoided any kind of closeness. Yet, every night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I felt an oppressive presence, a cold, relentless reminder of that careless ritual. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and I would catch fleeting glimpses of red, like the stain of spilled blood, scrawled in places I'd sworn were untouched. A text might appear on my phone in the dead of night, "The curse demands a sacrifice," or "Love is undoing." The words seared into my mind, leaving me paralyzed with dread. In a desperate search for answers, I turned to every scrap of folklore, every online forum dedicated to curses and dark magic. One theory emerged above all others. The curse we'd invoked was real, a malevolent force that feasted on every tender connection I allowed into my life. It was a cruel bargain. The curse promised to spare me only if I either embraced love wholeheartedly or succumbed entirely, letting death claim me as its final prize. The thought of opening my heart again, of risking another loss, was unbearable. Yet the alternative, the slow, inevitable decay of every relationship, every spark of hope, was equally harrowing. Then, when I had nearly resigned myself to a life of isolation, she appeared. Lily wasn't like anyone I'd ever known. She was gentle and unwavering, with eyes that held both sorrow and an unyielding promise of redemption. In her presence, the oppressive gloom that had shadowed my days began to lift ever so slightly. We spent long hours wandering empty streets after midnight, our conversations filled with cautious laughter and the tentative warmth of newfound intimacy. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love could be a salve for my wounded heart. But just as hope began to take root, my phone buzzed with the all-too-familiar dread. In the quiet of a rain-soaked evening, as Lily and I sat huddled under a flickering street lamp, the screen illuminated with a message that made my blood run cold. "You're next." The words were brief, but they carried the weight of every tragedy that had come before them. I felt as though 1,000 unseen eyes were judging me, as though the curse itself was tightening its grip around my soul. Haunted and desperate, I sought out any way to break the cycle. Late one night, under a sky churned with black clouds, I found myself standing before an abandoned church on the edge of town. A crumbling relic whispered to be a thin spot between the living and the dead. Inside, amidst the decay of forgotten prayers and shattered stained glass, I pleaded into the darkness. "I want this to," voice cracking with both terror and determination. "Either let me die, or let love free me." For a moment, the silence was absolute, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Then a cold wind swept through the desolate nave, and a voice, a sound like the rustle of dead leaves, whispered back, "The choice is yours." In that charged silence, I realized that the curse was not some external monster. It was the embodiment of my own fear, a dark mirror reflecting my inability to let myself love without the constant, paralyzing dread of loss. That night, as rain hammered the empty streets, I made a choice. I reached out to Lily with every ounce of vulnerability I possessed. I allowed her to see the parts of me I'd long kept hidden, the cracks filled with sorrow and hope. In her arms, I felt the warmth of genuine connection, a warmth that defied the chill of the curse. Yet even as our hearts began to entwine, my phone vibrated once more. Trembling, I glanced at the screen. The message was stark in its simplicity. "You're next." For an agonizing heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. I locked eyes with Lily, searching for reassurance in the depths of her steady gaze. In that moment, I understood that the curse had not been vanquished by love, but transformed by it. The dark force that had haunted me was bound by its own cruel terms. It would only release me if I fully embraced love, even with the ever-present risk of further loss. Now, as I write these words, the echoes of that final message still haunt me. Each Valentine's Day, I am reminded of the delicate balance between love and despair. I walk a path lined with both bitter memories and the tender promise of new beginning. I don't know if the curse is truly broken, or if it lurks in the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. But I choose to live with uncertainty. I choose to love, even as the words, "You're next," whisper in the back of my mind, a constant chilling reminder that every heartbeat carries both the risk of tragedy and the possibility. I had been looking forward to a quiet Valentine's Day getaway, a chance to escape the city's chaos with Claire, and immerse ourselves in the serene isolation of a remote cabin tucked deep within a snow-laden forest. For months, I'd daydreamed, a rustic haven with a roaring fireplace, the gentle crackle of burning wood, and endless expanses of pristine white snow stretching out under a cold, clear sky. Love was meant to be celebrated, but in our secluded retreat, it was to be savored in silence, away from the gaudy celebrations and forced declarations that so many found empty. The drive up the winding mountain road was treacherous that evening. Heavy snow had already started to fall, swirling in the frosty air like ghostly confetti. The car's wipers struggled to keep up. As I maneuvered along slick turns, my thoughts focused on the warm promise of the cabin waiting ahead. When I finally arrived, the sight of the little wooden house nestled among towering pines filled me with a sense of hopeful tranquility. Claire's eyes sparkled. We stepped out into the quiet dusk, the world around us muffled by a thick blanket of snow. Inside, The cabin was a cozy relic of simpler times. Rough-hewn wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and antique furnishings gave the place a timeless, almost otherworldly charm. We spent the early hours of the evening unpacking, lighting the fire, and preparing a modest meal. Laughter mingled with the gentle pop and crackle of burning logs, and for a while everything felt perfect. But as night deepened and the wind began to howl outside, I noticed something odd. While retrieving a bundle of firewood in the small porch, I stepped outside, only to be greeted by an unsettling sight. The snow that had blanketed the ground was no longer a pristine white. Instead, it was streaked with deep, dark red, a macabre tint that clung to every flake as if it were dusted with dried blood. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood transfixed in horror, staring at the crimson stains that marred the purity of the winter landscape. Inside, Claire's smile had faded into concern when I returned. "What did you see?" she asked in a hushed tone, her eyes wide with apprehension. I tried to reassure her with shaky laughter, suggesting it was merely a trick of the light or a reflection from the setting sun. Yet, as we peered out the window together, the truth was undeniable. The red tint persisted, vivid and unnerving against the muted white of the snow. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive. The wind's mournful wail outside seemed to echo with voices too faint to decipher, and every gust rattled the window panes as if trying to force its way in. A sense of dread seeped into our bones. It was then that we began to notice other anomalies. Scratches started to appear on the glass, a series of deliberate, almost rhythmic marks that traced along the edges of the windows. I pressed my ear to the cold pane, straining to hear any sound behind them, but the only response was the relentless pounding of my own heart. Determined to find an explanation, I ventured out into the forest the next morning. Clad in a heavy coat and boots, I trudged through the snow, each step sinking into the unnaturally soft, red-tinted surface. The silence of the woods was absolute, broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot and the distant cry of a winter bird. My breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as I followed a narrow, winding trail that led me deeper into the heart of the forest. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a small clearing that chilled me to the core. In the center lay a circle of scattered remnants, shattered fragments of what once might have been human lives. Pale, decaying forms were partially interred in the red snow, their features twisted in eternal expressions of terror and sorrow. My stomach churned at the sight, and a primal instinct urged me to flee. I hurried back to the cabin, every step haunted by the echo of lost voices. Back at the cabin, Claire and I huddled together, trying to piece together the fragments of local lore we had heard during our brief research before the trip. There were whispered legends about this very forest, stories of a brutal massacre long ago, where a group of star-crossed lovers were betrayed and slaughtered by a spurned paramour. According to the local lore, their blood had cursed the land, a curse that would awaken each year on a specific day in February, staining the snow in a ghastly reminder of their lost lives. That night, the true horror of the curse revealed itself. As twilight surrendered to darkness, a dense fog crept in from the forest, enveloping the cabin in an eerie, ghostly haze. The temperature plummeted suddenly, and with it came the sound of soft footsteps around the building. We bolted the doors and windows, our hands trembling uncontrollably as the sound of shuffling grew nearer. Through the small gaps in the wooden walls, we could glimpse shadowy figures moving silently among the trees. The red snow outside seemed to glow under their presence, casting a surreal light that made every contour of the forest appear twisted and unnerving. Then, the ancient landline phone, an artifact left behind by the cabin's previous occupants, rang with a shrill urgency. I answered it with shaking hands. On the other end, the line was initially silent, save for the sound of labored breathing. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from a long-forgotten era, a single mournful phrase broke the silence. "You belong to us now." The words sent a surge of cold terror through me, and I hung up immediately, unable to tear my mind away from the gravity of the curse we had unwittingly trespassed upon. For hours, we sat in a stifling silence, punctuated only by the eerie sounds from outside. The distant rustle of red snow sliding along the ground, the soft, mournful weeping that drifted on the wind, and the occasional clatter against the cabin walls. Every now and then, I thought I heard a woman's cry, a sound so heart-wrenching and full of despair that it made the blood in my veins freeze. It was as if the spirits of those betrayed lovers were not only mourning their own fate, but cursing any living soul who dared to disturb the sacred sorrow of that place. At the first light of dawn, the supernatural manifestations gradually subsided. The thick fog lifted, and the figures dissolved into the early morning mist. The red snow, however, a permanent, haunting reminder of the night's horror. With heavy hearts, Claire and I left the cabin, our retreat now transformed into a sight of unspeakable tragedy. The drive back was a blur of somber silence and haunted glances exchanged over the steering wheel. Even now, months later, the memory of that Valentine's Day refuses to fade. Every winter's snowfall, every whisper of wind through barren trees evokes the image of red snow and the tortured souls that it concealed. I find myself looking over my shoulder whenever I pass a snow-covered landscape, wondering if the curse might one day follow me home. The cabin, the forest, the cursed love that tainted that night, all have left an indelible mark on my soul. I often wonder if the curse will ever be truly broken or if it will continue to resurface year after year, claiming new victims in its relentless cycle of sorrow and blood. Until that day comes, I will carry the memory of that night, a night when a simple getaway turned into a living nightmare, where love was overshadowed by the eternal lament of the damned, and every falling snowflake whispered a tale of loss, betrayal, and a curse that refuses to be forgotten. I never cared much for Valentine's Day. The endless parade of cliched red hearts, overly saccharine gestures, and forced declarations of affection always left me cold. But that indifference shattered the day I received an unexpected package on a bitter winter morning. A package that would upend everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and the thin veil between life and what lies beyond. The package arrived without fanfare, deposited quietly on my stoop in the early light. Its paper was aged and delicately embossed with ornate patterns, and the address was written in an unfamiliar, almost archaic hand. I brought it inside, setting it carefully on my worn coffee table. There was no note on the outside, only an unsettling silence that seemed to press in around me. With hesitant fingers, I sliced through the tape and unwrapped the layers. Inside lay an antique mirror, its frame dark and intricately carved, with swirling motifs of twisted vines and broken hearts. Every curve of the wood was etched with an artistry that spoke of centuries past and of secrets best left unspoken. Tucked against the back of the mirror was a single folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the faded ink as it spelled out a message. For my lost love, may our hearts forever. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I had no memory of ever longing for someone lost, yet the melancholy tone resonated with a part of me I hadn't known existed. Despite my apprehension, I decided to display the mirror in my living room above the fireplace, where its eerie beauty could at least be admired from a distance. At first, the mirror seemed to simply reflect the modest room, its surface catching the flickering light of the fire in an almost mesmerizing dance. But soon, little inconsistency began to appear. I noticed that on quiet evenings, the reflection would lag behind my movement, just by a fraction, leaving behind a ghostly trail that vanished the moment I turned away. And then, one night while I was seated in my armchair, engrossed in a book, I caught something that made my blood run cold. In the mirror's reflection, a figure stood behind me, a woman in an antique dress, her eyes brimming with sorrow and longing. I whipped around, heart hammering, only to find an empty room. The fire's crackle was the only reply to my silent question. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly obsessed with that mirror. Its presence began to invade my thoughts. At night, I found myself drawn to its surface, almost as if it were calling to me. Sometimes I would see fleeting images, snatches of scenes that weren't mine, a glimpse of a lavish, candlelit ball, a sorrowful embrace between lovers, the soft glow of twilight over a forgotten cemetery. And always, the woman's face reappeared, mournful, pleading, as if begging for release from a grief too heavy to bear. The turning point came on the eve of Valentine. The air was unusually still, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on every window. I had barely eaten, consumed by an inexplicable need to understand the mirror's mystery. I began researching its origin, diving into local archives and poring over old newspapers. In the brittle pages of a century-old journal, I uncovered a chilling tale of a woman named Isabella, a beautiful soul whose tragic romance had ended in betrayal and heartbreak. Isabella had once been the beloved of a passionate man who, in a fit of jealous rage, had condemned her to a fate most cruel. According to the faded account, she had perished on Valentine's Day, her final moments steeped in sorrow, and her spirit had been bound to a mirror crafted as a token of eternal devotion. The journal hinted that the mirror was cursed, a relic meant to forever capture Isabella's undying anguish and to draw in another soul, destined to share her endless longing. The revelation sent a shockwave through me. Every time I had looked into the mirror, I had felt a tug at the edges of my heart, a resonance I could neither explain nor resist. That night, as a tempest raged outside and the wind howled like the voices of the damned, I sat before the mirror in the flickering candlelight. My reflection stared back, but behind me in the depths of the glass, the image of Isabella grew ever clearer. Her eyes, wide and luminous with sorrow, locked onto mine. For what felt like an eternity, the two of us simply regarded each other in a silent communion of shared despair. Finally, with a voice that trembled between hope and horror, she spoke, through the mirror, through the ether of time. "I loved him," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 broken promises. "And now I am lost. Will you complete our story?" The plea was so laden with yearning that it nearly drowned out the storm's fury outside. I recoiled as if struck, yet found myself unable to tear my gaze away. The mirror's surface shimmered, and slowly, the room around me seemed to blur into a swirl of memories and forgotten dreams. I felt a strange, magnetic pull, an invitation into a world where the boundaries between past and present, life and death, were hopelessly entangled. In the days that followed, my life began to unravel. I skipped meals, neglected work, and spent every waking moment lost in the mirror's depths. I noticed subtle changes in myself. Faint markings appeared on my skin, intricate patterns, reminiscent of the mirror's carving, as though I were slowly becoming a part of its cursed tapestry. One fateful night, as a violent storm raged once again, I awoke to the sound of shattering glass. Rushing into the living room, I found the mirror had fallen from its perch above the fireplace, its once pristine surface now fractured into a chaotic mosaic of reflections. In the jagged shards, I saw not only my own terrified face, but also dozens of ghostly images overlapping, a phantasmagoria of sorrowful visages with Isabella at its heart. Each fragment whispered its own lament, a symphony of heartbreak that made my chest tighten in unbearable pain. I sank to the floor as the room spun around me. In that moment of agonizing clarity, I realized that the mirror was not merely an object, but a living vessel for a curse, one that had chosen me to share in its eternal mourning. The fragments pulsed with an unearthly light, and through them, I saw Isabella once more. Her spectral figure loomed over me, her expression a blend of despair and an almost hypnotic allure. As if in a trance, I reached out toward the largest shard, the glass cool and possibly sharp against my skin. A surge of emotion, a mingling of terror, sorrow, and an inexplicable longing that transcended logic. In that final, fateful moment, the boundaries between our souls dissolved. The fractured mirror became a portal, and I felt myself being pulled into its depths, into the realm where Isabella's tragic love story had been doomed to repeat for all eternity. Now, as I recount these memories, I live in a perpetual twilight, a state of existence caught between what once was and what can never be again. The mirror still exists, scattered in countless shards throughout the place I once called home, each reflecting the sorrowful eyes of a lost, and sometimes on cold, lonely nights, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear soft, haunting, echoing through the darkness. I have become both witness and participant in a curse that binds our hearts, a sorrowful, a relentless cycle of unfilled love, eternal longing. Every Valentine pull, a cursed, a reminder of a love that was stolen, a destiny that now entwines with the ghost, a love story. No matter how desperately I try to escape, will forever be our shared tragic. I never believed in fate until the night I received an invitation that I couldn't refuse. It arrived on a chilly February afternoon, a heavy cream-colored envelope, embossed with intricate flourishes and sealed with a deep crimson wax. The envelope felt ancient in my hands, and as I broke the seal, a single sheet of parchment fell out. In elegant looping script, it read, "You are cordially invited to an evening of eternal devotion, where hearts converge beyond the bounds of. Join us at midnight at Blackwood Manor." At first, I dismissed it as an elaborate prank, a misdirected piece of theatrical mail designed to tease the romantics and cynics alike. I had always avoided Valentine's, scoffing at its commercial excess and forced sentimentality. Yet, something about the invitation's mysterious allure, the weight of its promise of a transcendent connection, stirred an inexplicable curiosity deep within me. For reasons I could not quite understand, I found myself unable to discard it. That night, as darkness blanketed the city, I decided to venture out. The invitation promised an experience beyond the mundane, a rare glimpse into something timeless and profound. I drove along winding roads until the urban landscape gave way to desolate countryside. A dense fog clung to the trees like spectral fingers, and the road ahead seemed to blur into a realm where time itself lost meaning. I arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the clock struck midnight. The mansion loomed before me, a grand, decaying relic hidden amid overgrown gardens and tangled ivy. Its Gothic architecture was both beautiful and foreboding. Tall, narrow windows stared out like empty eyes, and the heavy wooden door, adorned with iron studs, creaked open as if welcoming me into another world. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and old secrets. Candles burned in wall sconces along a long, shadowy corridor, their flames dancing in tune with the slow, melancholic strains of a waltz that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the mansion. I was greeted at the entrance of a vast foyer by a man whose presence commanded silent attention. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, with an accent that spoke of a bygone era, he wore a thin smile that did little to warm the chill of his pale features. "Welcome," he said, in a voice both velvety and chilling. "I am Mr. Blackwood, and I trust you have received our invitation." His eyes, dark and unyielding, seemed to look past me, as if assessing a soul already marked by destiny. I nodded uncertainly, unable to muster more than a tremulous yes. As I stepped further into the manor, I found myself surrounded by other guests, figures clad in vintage finery, their expressions poised in polite conversation, yet tinged with a sorrow that seemed to hover just beneath the surface. Their smiles were wistful, their eyes distant, as though they carried burdens too heavy for mortal hearts. The atmosphere was intoxicating, a strange blend of beauty and despair, as if every whispered word and measured step was part of an endless, sorrowful dance. I wandered into a grand hall where a polished marble floor reflected the shimmering light of countless chandeliers. Couples moved slowly in a waltz, their movements hypnotic and almost spectral. The music was at once enchanting and eerie, each note reverberating, a heartbeat echoing in a vast, empty. I felt as though I were caught between waking and dreaming, an observer in a ritual that defied the normal laws of time and space. The further I roamed, the more I began to notice subtle, unsettling details. In the quiet recesses of the manor, I glimpsed figures whose eyes glistened with an otherworldly light, their smiles fading into expressions of deep regret and longing. A woman in a faded crimson gown paused in the corner of a mirror-lined corridor, her gaze fixed on some unseen sorrow. A gentleman in a time-worn vest, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of grief, offered me a nod of recognition before disappearing into a shadowed alcove. It was as if each soul here had been captured by a curse, a ceaseless yearning for love lost and time irretrievably stolen. I attempted to find an exit, to leave this unsettling pageant behind, but every door I approached led me not to the outside world, but deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. My phone had long since died, its battery succumbing to the overwhelming atmosphere of antiquated technology and inexplicable dread. The mansion itself seemed to conspire with my growing panic, its passages twisting and narrowing, its walls whispering secrets in voices too soft to understand. Before I could fully comprehend my entrapment, Mr. Blackwood reappeared by my side. His expression was inscrutable as he leaned in close. "You seem troubled, my dear guest," he murmured. "Is the solitude of our eternal ball not to your liking?" His tone was polite, yet carried an undeniable edge, as if each word were meticulously chosen to remind me of my precarious position. I thought I might leave," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the murmuring strains of the waltz. "I didn't expect—" I trailed off, suddenly aware of the stares of the other guests, whose eyes gleamed in the candlelight with a sorrowful inevitability. "Leaving is not so simple here," he said softly, almost tenderly. "This night on Valentine's Day binds us together. Every soul here is drawn by the promise of eternal love, by the desire to never be alone, and now you are one." His words sank in like a slow, cold tide. I felt a creeping dread unfurling in my veins, as if the very air I breathed were laced with enchantment. I could neither resist nor escape. Desperation clawed at me. I retraced my steps through winding hallways, seeking any sign of an exit. Yet the manor shifted around me, corridors bending in impossible angles, doors vanishing into the dim corridors of forgotten rooms. I heard the echo of distant laughter, a sound that was both inviting and condemnatory, as if the building itself mocked my futile attempts at escape. In a moment of frenzied determination, I pushed through a heavy oak door and found myself in a long, narrow passage lined with portraits of somber-faced lovers. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me, their gazes heavy with unspoken laments. As I passed, I felt a chill brush against my neck, a caress both intimate and unnerving. I dared not look back, though I sensed that I was being pursued by shadows of the past. Then, from behind a set of towering double doors, the strains of the waltz grew louder and more insistent. I stepped into a vast ballroom, where hundreds of spectral couples moved in perfect, unending synchrony. The floor was a mosaic of polished stone, reflecting not only the flickering candlelight, but also the grief of countless hearts. The music swelled, a relentless cadence that resonated with the pulse of the night, and I found myself drawn inexorably toward the center of the dance. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to the last vestige, but the pull was irresistible. My feet began to move of their own accord, and soon I was swept into the embrace of the dance, a cold, unyielding waltz that erased the boundary between my heart and the darkness surrounded me. Faces blurred into one another, and I saw in each pair of eyes a shared despair, a silent acknowledgement that we were all prisoners in eternal Valentine. In that final, horrifying moment of clarity, I realized the true nature of my fate. The invitation had not been a mere chance encounter, but a summoning, a ritualistic call that bound those who were lured by the promise of everlasting love to the haunted corridors of Blackwood Manor. Mr. Blackwood's voice echoed in my mind, steps sealing my destiny. Love here is eternal, and you have chosen to accept it. Now, as I recount this in trembling, I remain a part of that ghostly ball, a restless spirit condemned to wander the halls of a where time stands still and sorrows constant. Every Valentine's Day, I sense the pull of the invitation, the lure of an eternal embrace that I can neither reject nor escape. And in the dim light of the manor's endless corridors, I hear the soft, haunting strains of a waltz that promises to carry me further into the darkness, where love and despair dance in endless, macabre celebration. I never cared for love, and Valentine's Day had always been nothing more than a commercial inconvenience, until the day a faded photograph found its way into my life and changed everything I thought I knew about longing and loss. It was a rainy afternoon when I wandered into the cramped back room of a small thrift store on the edge of town. I wasn't looking for anything special, just a way to pass the time on a gloomy day. As I meandered among dusty stacks of old records and yellowed books, my eyes were drawn to a battered, leather-bound frame tucked away behind a stack of forgotten knickknacks. Inside the frame lay a black and white photograph of a couple, posed with an intimacy that spoke of secrets and unspoken promises. The woman's eyes, though captured in monochrome, shimmered with a sorrow that was almost palpable. There was something in her gaze that made my skin prickle, a mixture of desire, regret, and an ineffable loneliness. Without fully understanding why, I purchased the frame and took it home. That evening, as a cold drizzle blurred the neon reflections on wet pavement, I set the photograph on the mantelpiece of my modest apartment. I intended to clean it, perhaps even hang it properly, but instead, I found myself transfixed by the image. I studied every detail, the careful way the man's hand rested on the woman's waist, the delicate lace of her dress, and most of all, the haunted look in her eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell me something, that her gaze reached out across time, pleading silently for recognition. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to unsettle my routine. At first, it was the way the photograph seemed to shift imperceptibly. One morning, I woke early to find the woman's expression altered. Her eyes now glistened with a deeper melancholy, and a faint trace of what looked like a tear streaked down her cheek. I chalked it up to my imagination, the result of staring too long at a relic of the past. But as nights turned into restless vigils, the disturbances grew more pronounced. I started to see her reflection when I passed by mirrors in my apartment, always positioned at the very edge of my vision. Once, while preparing dinner, I glimpsed the image of the woman superimposed behind me in the glass of my refrigerator. I spun around, heart hammering, but found nothing there except the familiar clutter of my kitchen. The sensation of being watched became constant, an unwelcome presence that clung to me like a second skin. I'd lie in bed listening to the rain tap on the window, certain I could hear a soft whisper, as if someone were reciting words meant only for me. It wasn't long before I discovered a small envelope tucked into the back of the frame. It was sealed with red wax, the emblem on it reminiscent of a long-forgotten crest. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. In elegant, looping script, it read, "My love, time has chained me in sorrow for centuries. Release me from this prison of memory and join me in eternal devotion." The words sent a chill down my spine. I felt an inexplicable pull, a connection to the desperate yearning expressed on that brittle paper. I began to research the origins of the photograph, scouring old newspaper clippings at the local library and delving into archives online. Slowly, I pieced together fragments of a tragic tale, a romance doomed from the start. The photograph, I learned, dated back to the early 1900s, capturing the final moments of a love affair that ended in a mysterious disappearance. The woman, whose name had been lost to time, was said to have vanished on Valentine's Day under inexplicable circumstances. Rumors had swirled for decades that her spirit remained tethered to the mortal realm, searching for a way to break the curse that bound her to a love that could never be fulfilled. Each new discovery only deepened my obsession. I began to hear her voice in dreams, soft, plaintive murmurs that implored me to find the truth and free me from these chains. At first, I resisted these nocturnal visitations, dismissing them as the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by late nights and lonely evenings. But the dreams grew more vivid, more insistent. In one, I found myself standing in a grand, decaying ballroom, where a spectral figure in a tattered gown danced alone among ghostly figures. When I turned, I saw her, the woman from the photograph, standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed on me with intensity that left me breathless. Unable to ignore the mounting evidence that something was terribly amiss, I sought out help from an antiquarian who specialized in obscure artifacts. He examined the frame and the photograph with a mixture of scholarly curiosity and quiet apprehension. "This isn't just an old family portrait," he murmured, his voice low. "There are legends about objects like these that carry echoes of past lives. They can bind you to a memory, to a spirit longing for resolution. Be cautious. Once a part of you, it may never truly let you go." His words echoed in my mind long after I left his cluttered shop. Yet, despite my growing unease, I could not part with the photograph. I felt compelled to understand the connection that seemed to defy the boundaries of time. The more I delved into the mystery, the stronger the presence became. Objects in my apartment would inexplicably shift positions overnight, and I often awoke to find the photograph turned so that the woman's eyes appeared to be looking directly at me. I began to keep a journal of the strange occurrences, a record of my nightly dreams, the subtle alterations in the image, increasing intensity of that unseen gaze. One particularly stormy Valentine's Eve, when the wind howled like a chorus of anguished souls and the rain battered my window in relentless fury, I decided to confront the presence directly. I sat alone in the darkness of my living room, the only light coming from a single candle whose flame trembled in the gusts of wind. Clutching the envelope containing the letter, I addressed the silence as if she were there with me. "Who are ye?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the storm. "What do you want from me?" For several agonizing moments, there was only the sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, as if in answer, the temperature in the room dropped dramatic. The candle's flame faltered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. In the wavering light, I saw her, there, standing at the foot of my sofa, as real as any living person. Her appearance was both ethereal and heartbreakingly fragile. The gown she wore was tattered and stained with what appeared to be tears, and her eyes, those same eyes from the photograph, shone with a sorrow that transcended mortal pain. "I have waited so long," in a voice that was at once a whisper and a plea. "I have been chained to this, trapped in a world of regret and unfulfilled promises. I need you to free me." Her words sent tremors through my soul. I wanted to recoil, to dismiss this apparition as a figment of my own tormented mind. But there was an undeniable sincerity, a raw, desperate longing that mirrored my own hidden yearning. "How?" to ask, voice trembling. "How can I help you?" She stepped closer, the edges of her form blurring as if she were half dissolving into the night. "There is a way, a ritual of remembrance and release. I must be reunited with the man who betrayed me, so that his memory may be laid to rest, and I can finally find. Only then will the chains that bind me shatter, and my soul." In that moment, I realized the terrible paradox. By aiding her, I would be entangling myself in a tragic web of past lives and cursed love. I was already beginning to feel the pull, a subtle melding of our emotions, as if our hearts were starting to beat in unison. The decision was no longer mine to make. I had become a willing participant in her desperate quest for redemption. Over the following weeks, under the oppressive weight of a destiny I never sought, I immersed myself in the obscure lore of the lost lovers. I combed through ancient diaries, letters, and newspaper clippings, piecing together the remnants of a love that had ended in betrayal and bloodshed. I learned that her lover, a man of charm and ambition, had been driven by jealousy and rage to commit a deed so heinous that it had sealed her fate. The town's records whispered of a scandal too dreadful to speak aloud, and the lovers had been condemned to an existence of separation and sorrow. long before modern memory. Each clue brought me closer to the truth, and closer to the inevitable confrontation with the dark force that had orchestrated this unholy union. Every night, as I sat by the light of a flickering candle, I felt her presence growing stronger, more insistent. I began to see her reflection in every window and mirror, a silent companion in my waking hours and my nightmares. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the periphery, a man whose features were blurred by time, his eyes filled with both regret and malevolence. It was as though the very air around me was steeped in the unresolved passion and bitterness of that long-forgotten affair. Then, on a particularly cold and unforgiving Valentine's morning, I received a package. It arrived without any explanation, just a plain, unadorned box left on my doorstep. Inside, carefully wrapped in faded velvet, lay a single ornate locket. The locket was engraved with the initials of the betrayed lover, and when I opened it, a tiny sepia-toned portrait of a man stared back at me. His expression was, and his eyes seemed to plead for absolute. A scrap of paper accompanied the locket, bearing a final, desperate inscription: "Remember and let me go." That was the moment when I understood the terrible cost of what I had been drawn in. To free her, I would have to face the darkness of human passion, the cruelty of betrayal, and the ghosts of a love that had doomed them both. I found myself standing before an ancient oak in a forgotten cemetery at dusk, a place where the past and present coalesced in a tapestry of sorrow and regret. In my trembling hand, I clutched the locket as I recited the incantation found in a brittle, time-worn journal. The words, heavy with grief and longing, resonated through the silent night. As the final syllable faded into the cold air, the ground beneath me trembled. A spectral wind swept through the cemetery, scattering leaves like the remnants of broken dreams. In the center of the clearing, the apparition of the betrayed lover materialized, a gaunt figure with eyes that burned with a remorseful fire. His voice, hoarse and laden with anguish, echoed in the darkness. "I have my guilt." For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. The spirit reached out, and I felt an intense surge of sorrow and release, as if decades of pent-up regret were poured into my soul. Then, with a final anguished cry, the spectral form began to dissolve into a mist of memories and whispers. Simultaneously, the presence of the woman grew fainter, her figure softening, till she, too, was nothing more than a lingering echo of what once was. In the aftermath of that terrible night, a profound silence descended upon me, a silence filled with both relief and an abiding melancholy. The photograph that had once dominated my living room now lay on the floor, its image finally still, as if the storm of emotions it had invoked had passed. The locket, once a symbol of accursed love, now rested in my palm, its inscription faded but its meaning indelible. I still feel her presence in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, in the whisper of the wind, or in the reflection of a rain-soaked window. And every Valentine's Day, as I remember the price of releasing a tormented soul, I am reminded that love, in its most desperate form, can transcend time, but it may also leave scars that never fully fade. I have learned that some memories are better left undisturbed, that some longings are cursed to echo in the silence of forgotten hearts. And though I try to move forward with my life, I can never quite escape the soft, mournful refrain of that tragic love, a reminder that even the purest desire for freedom can come at a soul-wrenching cost. I'd always been indifferent to Valentine's Day, a day of saccharine sentiments and predictable cliches, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of the fateful evening. It began with a package, delivered on a rain-soaked afternoon as the city trembled under a relentless downpour. The parcel, wrapped in faded brown paper and tied with a frayed red ribbon, bore no return address. Its presence was both curious and disquieting, as if it had materialized from the mist of a long-forgotten. With hesitant hands, I brought it inside, setting it on my cluttered coffee table, amidst a scattering of old receipts and half-read novels. Inside the package lay an object that seemed to breathe history, a vintage music box, its wooden casing intricately carved with delicate vines and subtle hearts, each etching worn by time. The lid, polished to a soft sheen, bore an inscription in ornate script: "For the lonely heart that dares to remember." I turned it over in my hands, feeling an inexplicable pull, as though the relic had been waiting for me. Despite the odd chill that crept along my spine, I couldn't resist winding it up. At first, nothing happened. Then, as twilight deepened into an inky night, the mechanism began to stir. A gentle, almost imperceptible melody emerged, a slow, haunting tune that seemed to whisper of distant memories and unspoken sorrows. The sound was delicate, its notes quivering like droplets on a fragile glass. I sat in the dim glow of my living room, mesmerized by the soft chime echoing in the silence, each note carrying a melancholy that tugged at the corners of my heart. As midnight approached, the music box's melody grew stronger, more insistent. I found myself drawn to its rhythmic cadence, as though the tune were weaving a spell around me. With every revolution of its tiny gears, the room seemed to shift imperceptibly. Shadows stretched in unusual patterns along the walls, and the air grew cooler, dense with the scent of old wood and forgotten dreams. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the music transport me. In that vulnerable space between wakefulness and sleep, I began to see images, fleeting, ghostly visions of a time long past. I saw a woman in a flowing, antique dress with eyes full of yearning and grief. She stood in a sunlit garden, surrounded by roses whose petals glistened with dew, and her gaze was fixed upon something beyond my reach. The vision faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with an aching sense of loss and a sudden, inexplicable familiarity. A soft knock at my door startled me out of my reverie. I hesitated before rising, the music box's tune still echoing in my ears, as if it were the only link to that mysterious apparition. Peering through the peephole, I found nothing, only the dark, rain-slicked hallway of my apartment building. But when I returned to my seat, I realized that the music box was still playing, its melody now punctuated by a subtle, rhythmic tapping, as if someone or something was gently rapping along with the tune. I tried to dismiss the sensation as a trick of my imagination, a side effect of exhaustion and the haunting beauty of the music. Yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, a series of uncanny occurrences began to unravel around me. The lights in my apartment flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that mimicked the movements of a silent waltz. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of a reflection in the window, a figure standing just outside, barely visible through the rain. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or a specter come to life, but its presence filled me with a deep, unnameable dread. Driven by a mix of trepidation and an insatiable need to understand, I approached the music box again. I inspected it closely, running my fingers over the carving as the melody played on. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Engraved into the underside of the lid, almost hidden by the wear of time, were the initials EL. Beneath those letters, in even smaller script, was a date, February 14th, 1924. My heart thumped painfully in my chest as I realized that the music box was not only old, but also tethered to a day that had always filled me with a muted sense of disquiet. Unable to shake the sensation that the music box was more than a mere antique, I took to researching its origins the following morning. I scoured local archives and old newspapers at the nearby library, piecing together fragments of history. Slowly, I uncovered a tragic tale. In the early 1920s, a woman named Eleanor Larkham had been the darling of society, a bright, vivacious soul whose love affair with a dashing young poet had been the talk of the town. But their romance, intense and fervent, ended in heartbreak. Rumors swirled that on one fateful Valentine's Day, Eleanor's lover had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving her inconsolable and forever haunted by grief. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor was seen wandering the estates of the city, her eyes forever fixed on the horizon as though waiting for a return that would never come. Within a year, she had disappeared from public view entirely. Her fate remained shrouded in mystery, a mystery that seemed to seep into every crevice of the music box before me. That evening, as I sat alone with the music box playing its forlorn melody, I felt an overwhelming presence in the room. The temperature dropped further, and the shadows on the walls coalesced into shapes that resembled figures from another time. And then, with a sudden clarity that sent a jolt through my entire being, I heard a soft, plaintive whisper near my ear, a whisper that echoed Eleanor's sorrow. "Set me free," the voice pleaded, fragile yet laden with despair. I nearly dropped the music box in shock. The words were not part of the melody. They were an invocation, a desperate cry from beyond. My pulse pounded as I realized that the spirit of Eleanor Larkham might be intertwined with this cursed object, reaching out across the decades for a resolution to her eternal sorrow. Torn between fear and compassion, I resolved to help, despite the terror that knotted my stomach. In the following days, I plunged into research with a fervor I'd never known. I sought out records, diaries, and accounts of Eleanor's life, piecing together the fragments of her doomed romance. I learned that her lover, a man of considerable promise, had been implicated in a scandal, an affair steeped in jealousy and betrayal that had led to a violent confrontation. While no one knew precisely what had become of him, local legend held that his disappearance was as much a part of the curse as Eleanor's endless mourning. The more I learned, the more I sensed that the music box was a vessel for her undying grief, a relic that bridged the gap between life and death. Late one stormy Valentine's Eve, when the wind howled outside like the wails of 1,000 lost souls, I decided to confront the force that had invaded my life. I set the music box in the center of my living room, its tiny gears ticking in the oppressive silence, and I gathered every scrap of research I'd accumulated. With trembling determination, I recited an incantation I'd found in an old folktale, a plea for liberation and reconciliation with the past. As I spoke, the room darkened, and the melody of the music box swelled into a crescendo that matched the rising tempest outside. The air around me grew charged, as if thick with unspoken promises and unfulfilled love. In the flickering candlelight, I saw the shadowy outline of a woman forming in the space before me. Eleanor, unmistakable in her sorrow, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, locked with mine, and the room filled with the palpable weight of a lifetime of loss. I have waited so long. Her voice a fragile thread weaving the roaring wind. Let my heart find peace. With each word, I felt her pain and longing infuse my own spirit. I reached out, hesitantly touching the cool surface of the music box, as if to anchor both of our souls in the present. In that moment, the boundaries between our lives dissolved. The music box vibrated with a fervor that matched my racing heartbeat, and a torrent of vision. Moments of joy and despair, love and betrayal, washed over me. I saw Eleanor laughing under a summer sun, dancing with her lover in a garden of roses, and then, in a heartbeat, I witnessed the betrayal that shattered her world and doomed her to endless mourning. The final vision was the most wrenching. Eleanor, standing alone on a desolate street as snow began to fall on a cold Valentine, her eyes fixed on a horizon that promised reunion, yet delivered only solitude. The music box's melody mingled with her silent sobs, creating a dirge that echoed through the corridors of time. As the storm outside abated and the first pale light of dawn crept through my window, the apparition of Eleanor began to fade. Her final words, carried on the dying notes of the music box, trembled in the air. Thank you for remembering. In that instant, the oppressive chill lifted, and the room returned to its quiet, somber normality. The music box, its purpose seemingly fulfilled, slowly wound down to silence, its gears coming to a gentle stop. I sat alone in the aftermath, heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The music box remained on the table, its carved surface now imbued with a subtle warmth, a silent testament to the release of a tortured soul. Though I knew that the scars of that night would linger in my memories, I also felt a quiet solace in having helped Eleanor find a measure of peace at last. Every Valentine's Day since, when the wind carries a hint of that old, melancholic tune, I remember the lonely heart that dared to reach out from the past. And in the silent spaces between memory and reality, I can still hear her gentle, grateful whisper, a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love is the courage to remember and to let go. I never paid much attention to Valentine's Day, just another day in a calendar that forced people to parade their affections like trophies. I'd grown accustomed to quiet evenings spent with a book or a half-watched film, rather than the fanfare of forced romance. That all changed the day I received a mysterious package on a dreary February afternoon. The package arrived without ceremony, slipping through my mail slot as if delivered by a phantom hand. Wrapped in soft black tissue paper and tied with a single crimson ribbon, it bore no return address or note, only an embossed inscription on the top. For the seeker of truth in matters of the heart. My pulse quickened as I carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a heavy, leather-bound deck of tarot cards, each card crafted with astonishing detail and printed on vellum that looked as though it might crumble under too much light. The cover, embossed in faded gold, read simply, Tarot of the Heart. I wasn't a believer in fortune-telling or the occult, yet something about the deck's aura stirred a dormant curiosity within me. That night, after a restless dinner and a few too many anxious sips of black coffee, I sat alone in my dim living room and spread the cards out on the coffee table. I'd read somewhere that tarot could reveal hidden truths about one's future, but as I traced my fingers over the intricate designs, I began to feel an inexplicable chill, as if the cards were alive, pulsing with a secret yearning. I decided to perform a reading, more out of a desire to dispel my mounting unease than any genuine belief. I shuffled the deck slowly, each card's surface cold against my skin. When I finally laid out the first card, the lovers, it struck me immediately that something was off. The image depicted two figures, but one face was obscured by a creeping shadow, a void that seemed to absorb all light. The normally hopeful card exuded an air of sorrow and foreboding. As the night deepened, I continued the reading, drawing card after card. The tower, usually a harbinger of sudden upheaval, was rendered in tones of deep crimson and charred black, its imagery twisted into jagged ruins with spectral silhouettes looming in the background. And then came death, not the reaper, but a skeletal figure draped in tattered finery, its eyes hollow and mournful, as though it carried the weight of 1,000 unfulfilled romances. Every card seemed to whisper a mournful tale of love lost and lives shattered, and with each revelation, I felt as though an unseen hand were closing around my heart. That night's sleep proved elusive. When I finally succumbed to exhaustion, my dreams were invaded by a presence, a woman draped in a tattered gown, her face a shifting mask of grief and longing. I saw her wandering through a sepia-toned landscape of wilted roses and abandoned ballroom, her eyes searching for something or someone that would never return. In her half-whispered lament, I heard the word, "Fine," as if my very soul were beckoned to complete a ritual I didn't understand. In the days that followed, the tarot deck began to reveal more than I could have intended. I would catch fleeting glimpses, spectral woman in the corners of my vision, a reflection in a dark window, a shape in the mirror that disappeared when I turned to look directly. The cards, once inert objects, now seemed to rearrange them on my table overnight. I would wake to find the deck fanned out in a pattern that wasn't the one I had left, as if an unseen hand had taken over my ritual. Driven by a growing sense of dread, I sought answers in local archives and obscure internet forums. Late one rainy evening, I discovered an old article about a woman named Isabel Hartwell, a brilliant poet and artist who vanished on Valentine's Day nearly a century ago. Rumors swirled that Isabel had been in a doomed romance with a man whose passion turned to obsession, and that when his jealousy reached a fevered pitch, he cursed her with a love so intense it trapped her soul in the world of the living. The article mentioned that in her final days, she had been known to frequent seances and arcane gatherings, desperate to break free of a fate that condemned her to endless mourning. Some believed that her spirit, bound by an unfulfilled love and fueled by a desperate need for relief, had been inadvertently captured by a cursed tarot deck crafted by an occultist who shared her tragic vision. The more I learned, the more I sensed a connection between the deck and the spectral figure in my dreams. I began to see her in the flicker of candlelight and hear her sigh in the rustle of the wind outside my window. It was as if the tarot deck had become a portal, a conduit through which Isabel's sorrowful spirit reached out to the living, seeking liberation from a past steeped in heartbreak and vengeance. My unease transformed into a compulsion. I started performing nightly readings, desperate to decipher the cryptic messages the cards offered. Each reading revealed new fragments of a narrative I could scarcely piece together, a tale of love betrayed, promises broken, and a soul ensnared by a curse that demanded to be undone. The lover's card would always appear, its shadowed face a stark reminder of Isabel's hidden anguish. The hanged man seemed to mirror my own sense of helplessness as I became increasingly trapped in the cycle of her grief. And the final card, the Fool, beckoned me with an invitation to step off the edge into the unknown. On the eve of the following Valentine's Day, as the wind howled outside and the rain hammered against my windows like the frantic drumming of a desperate heart, I resolved to confront the mystery once and for all. I arranged the tarot deck in a circle on the hardwood floor of my living room, the cards facing inward, forming a protective barrier. I lit a series of candles, their weak flames trembling in the gusts that seeped through the old window panes, and sat in the center of the circle. With trembling hands, I opened the deck to the page marked by a faint, handwritten note on the back, a note in a delicate script that simply read, "Complete the ritual." I began reciting the incantation I had found in one of the archaic journals, a prayer of release and redemption meant to sever the ties of a cursed bond. As I spoke the words, the room seemed to contract, the air thickening with an otherworldly pressure. The candles sputtered, and for a brief moment, darkness swallowed the circle. When the light returned, I saw her standing at the edge, a translucent figure, her eyes brimming with a sorrow that defied the ages. Isabel Hartwell, her ethereal form barely more than a shimmer of light and shadow, stepped forward. "Thank you for," her voice soft and laden with centuries of despair. "I have for so long." Her presence was overwhelming, a mingling of beauty and terror, the embodiment of every unspoken grief and every broken promise. She reached out a hand, and as I hesitated, I felt an irresistible pull, as though she were drawing me into the tapestry of her tragic existence. In that moment, the room filled with the murmurs of lost souls and the rustle of pages from forgotten diaries. The tarot cards began to glow with a cold, spectral light, each one revealing glimpses of a past marked by love's cruel twists and the inevitability of fate. Isabel's eyes, deep pools of sorrow, locked onto mine. "I cannot find rest until the curse is lifted," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and resignation. "Only by embracing the final step can I be free, and you too must choose. Will you complete this ritual with me?" A surge of conflicting emotions flooded me: fear, empathy, and an inexplicable desire to set things right. I knew that the ritual might cost me more than I was willing to pay, that in binding my fate to hers, I might doom myself to share in her eternal longing. Yet, the yearning to bring peace to a tortured soul, to undo the legacy of a love gone tragically awry, overpowered my instinct to flee. With a steadying breath, I nodded. "I will," my voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. As I spoke those words, the atmosphere shifted. The candle's flames danced wildly, casting flickering images on the walls, and the tarot cards rumbled with a soft, unearthly vibration. Isabel moved closer, and in a final, poignant moment, she pressed her cold, translucent hand against mine. I felt a jolt of icy energy surge through me, and the boundaries between our souls began to blur. In a rush of overwhelming sensation, a torrent of memories, regrets, and bittersweet moments of love, I was drawn into a vision that spanned lifetimes. I saw Isabel as she had once been, a radiant woman filled with hope and passion, laughing in the golden light of a summer afternoon, dancing under starry skies with the man who had sworn eternal devotion. But the vision darkened, revealing betrayal and heartbreak, a violent confrontation under a blood-red sky on a fateful Valentine's Day. The moment her world shattered and her spirit was ensnared in a cruel curse, I saw the occultist, his eyes gleaming with manic fervor as he crafted the tarot deck to capture her sorrow, binding her essence to the cards so that every future seeker of love would share in her pain. Tears blurred my vision as the final images faded, leaving only the echo of Isabel's soft plea in the charged silence. "Release me," she whispered, and with those words, the spectral bindings snapped. The glow from the cards flared one last time, then dimmed to a gentle, fading luminescence. Isabel's form wavered like smoke in the wind, and slowly, her features softened into an expression of peaceful surrender. For a long, heavy moment, I sat alone in the circle, the only sound the gentle drip of melting candle wax. The tarot deck lay silent before me, its cards now ordinary relics of a night that felt both eternal and fleeting. I realized with a bittersweet clarity that the ritual had come at a profound cost. By agreeing to free Isabel, I had entwined my fate with hers. I could feel it, a subtle, enduring ache in my chest, as if a part of her sorrow now lived within me, a quiet reminder of a love that transcended time. In the days that followed, life took on a new, somber cadence. I still found myself drawn to the tarot deck, its once ominous presence now a constant companion in my solitude. I would often catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, or hear a whisper when the night was at its darkest, an echo of Isabel's gratitude, a soft murmur of thanks carried on the wind. And every Valentine's Day, as the world around me celebrated love with bright colors and fleeting gesture, I would remember that stormy night when I had bridged the gap between two souls. I carried within me the legacy of a tragic romance, a bittersweet reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love demand the deepest sacrifice. Even now, as the seasons change and life trudges on with its familiar rhythms, I feel the gentle pull of that night, a quiet, constant presence in my heart. And in the silent hours before dawn, when the world is shrouded in darkness and memory, I can still hear her soft, spectral whisper, "Thank you for loving me enough to..." I never paid much heed to the empty promises of Valentine's, just another day on which society paraded its contrived affection. That indifference was shattered the night a single, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox, its handwriting delicate and unmistakably old-fashioned. There was no return address, only the words, "Attend the silent serenade," embossed in deep crimson. Despite my habitual skepticism toward romantic gimmicks, an unbidden curiosity stirred inside me, compelling me to follow the invitation's inscrutable call. At midnight that February night, I found myself driving through desolate streets, shrouded in a thick, silvery fog. The city's neon glow had long been swallowed by darkness as I navigated winding roads toward a destination I barely recognized. A grand, abandoned opera house looming at the edge of town, Its once opulent facade, draped in ivy and scarred by time, seemed to whisper secrets of bygone splendor and hidden sorrow. I parked my car beneath a flickering street lamp and stepped out into the chill. The air was heavy with mist, the faint scent of decaying roses, and each footstep echoed in a silence that felt both anticipatory and foreboding. Approaching the massive double doors of the opera house, I hesitated as if unsure whether I was about to trespass on a place meant only for memories. Yet, the invitation's mysterious allure overpowered my reluctance. Inside, the cavernous foyer was cloaked in darkness, except for the erratic light of a few dusty chandeliers that hung like forgotten relics. My footsteps disturbed motes of dust that danced in the pale beams, and the silence was punctuated only by the distant drip of water and the creak of old floorboards. I could feel the weight of the past pressing in on me, as if the very walls were imbued with the sorrows of lost love and shattered dreams. Drawn onward by a force I could neither understand nor resist, I wandered down a long, narrow corridor lined with tattered velvet curtains and portraits of elegantly dressed figures whose eyes seemed to follow my every move. At the corridor's end, a heavy red curtain parted to reveal a grand stage bathed in a ghostly pallor. Before any audience could be gathered, I realized that I was the only living soul in attendance, or so I assumed. Then, as if summoned from the depths of silence, a solitary note rang out. It was the first gentle stroke of a piano, soft and tremulous, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The sound was at once beautiful and utterly haunting. I sat down on a creaking bench in the front row, heart pounding in rhythm with solitary notes, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The music swelled slowly, a melancholic melody that filled the vast emptiness with an inexplicable longing. As the notes poured forth, I saw a figure materialize at center stage, a man dressed in an antiquated tuxedo, his face obscured by the shadows. He sat at a grand, dust-laden piano that seemed as much a relic as the building itself. With each measured keystroke, his music wove a tapestry of heartbreak and hope, a silent narrative of a love lost to time. I found myself transfixed by his performance. Every note was saturated with an emotion so raw, it almost hurt to listen. The melody evoked visions in my mind's eye. A sunlit garden where lovers once strolled hand in hand, now replaced by a lone figure in a dilapidated carriage, weeping beneath a weeping willow. The music was more than it was a living thing that stirred something deep and ancient within me. As the performance progressed, subtle changes began to ripple through the opera house. Shadows shifted unnaturally along the walls, elongating and twisting as if in slow motion dance. In the far corners of the auditorium, faint shapes of spectral figures dressed in period finery, their eyes vacant yet sorrowful, as though they had come to witness the same tragic performance over and over again. I could almost hear them murmuring words lost to time, their voices blending with the strains of the piano into a ghostly chorus. At the crescendo of the piece, the pianist's eyes lifted from the keys and met mine. In that fleeting, electrifying moment, I saw a depth of despair and longing that transcended mortal sorrow. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see the secrets I buried in my heart. The music faltered for a heartbeat, and in that silence, I sensed a presence behind me. I turned, half expecting to see another living soul, but there was nothing, only the heavy darkness of the hall. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the performance resumed with renewed intensity. The spectral figures in the wings seemed to sway in unison with the music, their outlines blurred and insubstantial, like memories that could never be reclaimed. I felt as if I were standing at the crossroads of time and oblivion, caught between the living world and a realm of eternal melancholy. The haunting melody began to morph, its gentle strains giving way to a more urgent, almost pleading tempo. The pianist's fingers danced across the keys with feverish energy, and his eyes, now glistening with unshed tears, locked onto mine again. It was then that I noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere, a palpable pressure that seemed to constrict the very air around me. The temperature dropped, and the once distant whispers of the ghostly audience grew louder, converging into a singular, desperate plea that echoed in the cavernous space. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to rise and approach the stage, to confront the man whose music had ensnared my soul. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, yet I found myself rooted to the spot, as though the hands of fate had bound me to this moment. With each note, the boundaries between the spectral and the corporeal thinned, and I could no longer discern whether the music was being played for me or by me. Then, in the midst of the swirling emotions and haunting strains, the pianist spoke, his voice soft, almost imperceptible, the fading echoes of the last chord. I have loved and lost, so completely that my heart can bear no more, he murmured, his words resonating with the same sorrow that imbued the melody. Tonight, on this day of all love, I beg you, listen, remember, and join me in this eternal lament. The sound of his voice was like a key turning in a long forgotten lock. In that moment, I understood that the invitation had not been a mere summons to a concert, but a call to bear witness to a tragedy that had spanned decades, a tragedy that demanded a new witness, perhaps even a new participant. The realization sent a shock of terror through me. Had I, in my own solitude and quiet longing, unwittingly become a part of this spectral performance? Was I destined to share in the pianist's heartbreak, to be ensnared by his unyielding grief? Before I could muster a response, the music swelled to a final, heart-wrenching climax. The spectral audience seemed to rise as one, a tide of sorrow that swept through the hall. I felt an icy hand brush my shoulder, and when I turned, I caught a glimpse of a woman in a flowing, translucent gown standing at the very edge of the stage. Her eyes, filled with an ineffable sadness, met mine for a heartbeat before she faded into the shadows like mist dissolving at dawn. As the last note trembled into silence, the hall was left in a stunned, oppressive quiet. I stood alone in that haunted space, the echoes of the silent serenade lingering like a bittersweet promise. Slowly, I made my way toward the exit, only to find that the heavy doors had closed of their own accord, sealing me inside. Panic fluttered in my chest as I grasped for any escape, but the corridors of the opera house had transformed into a labyrinth of twisting passageways and shifting shadows. Desperation clawed at my mind as I retraced my steps, the ghostly strains of the melody following me, persistent refrain. I passed mirrors that reflected not only my own terrified visage, but also fleeting images of the pianist, a man whose eyes bore the weight of centuries and whose sorrow seemed to seep into the very glass. In one such mirror, I saw not my own face, but a pale, tear-streaked countenance that resembled the spectral performer on stage. The sight sent me reeling, and I stumbled back, heart pounding in terror. At length, I found a door that led into a narrow backstage corridor. I pressed it open, and the cold, musty air that greeted me was laced with the faint, lingering notes of the melody. As I advanced, the corridor grew darker, the walls lined with old costumes and faded playbills, telling tales of once glorious performances. In the dim light, I caught sight of an ornate mirror leaning against a battered dressing table. For a moment, I paused before it, drawn by compulsion I could neither resist nor explain. In the mirror's tarnished surface, I saw myself, and behind me, the ghostly pianist. His eyes were fixed on mine with a desperate intensity, as though he sought to transfer his own pain into my soul. The realization was staggering. I had become entangled in his eternal requiem, a living witness to a love that had long since dissolved into sorrow. And in that moment, I understood the true nature of the silent serenade. It was not merely a performance, but a ritual, a means of binding lost souls to the living world through the power of unfulfilled love. A chill swept through me as the pianist's image began to fade, replaced by the soft, persistent murmur of voices, voices that seemed to plead for release, for redemption. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and in its depths, I saw flashes of a past filled with joy and agony. Lovers dancing beneath moonlit skies, promises made in whispered tones, and hearts broken by betrayal. It was a tapestry of emotion, too vast and sorrowful for mortal comprehension. In that final, heart-stopping instant, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could attempt to break free of the spell that had ensnared me, or I could surrender, allowing the music and the memories to claim me as one of their own. The echo of the pianist's desperate plea still resonated in the silence. Listen, remember, and join me. Tears welled in my eyes. With a trembling exhale, I reached out and pressed my hand against the cold surface of the mirror. In that moment, the boundaries between my soul and the tragic memories of the opera house dissolved into a single, overwhelming tide of emotion. The last strains of the silent serenade mingled with my heartbeat, and I felt myself slipping into a state of eternal remembrance, a state where love and sorrow were forever intertwined. I do not know if I ever emerged from that night as the person I once was, or if I became another shadow among the countless lost souls destined to wander the decaying halls of that haunted opera house. All I know is that the melody still echoes in my mind on lonely nights, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of art and the deepest expressions of love carry within them a sorrow that can never be truly escaped. I'd never believed in the old family legend that a secret, cursed garden lay hidden on the outskirts of our ancestral estate until the day a faded envelope found its way into my hands. I was sorting through a box of my late grandmother's belongings when I discovered it. A cream-colored envelope sealed with crimson wax and embossed with an unfamiliar sigil. In neat, flowing script, it read, "The Garden of Thorns awaits your heart this Valentine's night." Though I'd always dismissed Valentine's Day as little more than a commercial trifle, something in that message stirred a long-dormant curiosity, compelling me to follow its eerie invitation. That night, under a leaden sky and a chill that crept beneath my skin, I set out in my old car. The city lights soon faded behind me as I drove down winding country roads, their curves and bends echoing the twisting lines of an ancient rose vine. The air was unnaturally still, as though nature itself were holding its breath. Every mile I put between the familiar chaos of urban life and the mystery of the unknown heightened the disquiet simmering in my chest. When I finally arrived at the estate's outskirts, the road gave way to a narrow, unpaved lane bordered by wild hedgerows. Here, the landscape transformed into a spectral vision, a forgotten parkland overgrown with tangled briars and tall, gnarled trees whose branches clawed at the heavy night sky. In the distance, beyond a crumbling wrought iron gate, I discerned the faint outline of a garden, one that looked as though it had once been a place of beauty, now surrendered to decay and haunted by the past. Pushing open the rusted gate, I stepped into the garden and was immediately enveloped by an atmosphere of oppressive melancholy. The pathway, barely visible beneath a thick carpet of fallen leaves and scattered petals, wound its way among clusters of roses. Some were vibrant, defiantly red even in the gloom. Others had withered into shades of black and deep burgundy, their petals brittle and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The scent was heady, a mix of cloying perfume and decay that seemed to seep into my very bones. I moved slowly along the path, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth, as if the garden itself wished to keep my presence secret. There was a silence here that was far from peaceful. It was a heavy, expectant silence, punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant, almost inaudible sound of weeping. The air vibrated with memories too ancient to name, and with each step I felt as though unseen eyes were following me from behind the dense foliage. Almost imperceptibly, I began to notice strange markings on the stone bench set beneath a large, twisted rosebush. Carved deep into the surface were words, names, dates, and cryptic phrases intertwined with the image of a heart ensnared by thorns. As I traced my fingers over the carvings, I sensed a profound sorrow, as if each stroke were a lament for a love long lost. I couldn't shake the impression that these inscriptions were a chronicle of a tragic romance, etched by the hands of those whose hearts had been broken to repair. Further along the path, I came upon an old stone statue partially obscured by ivy. The statue depicted a woman with delicate features, her expression frozen in eternal grief. Her eyes, though carved from cold stone, seemed to glisten in the faint moonlight, and her outstretched hand pointed toward a small, overgrown arbor. As I approached, a sudden gust of wind stirred the leaves and sent a shiver racing along my spine. In that moment, I swore I heard a soft, plaintive whisper, a voice so fragile and laden with despair that it nearly broke my resolve. "Remember me." I froze in place, heart pounding in my ears. The sound felt intimately personal, as though it came from someone who knew my secrets. I looked around wildly, expecting to see another visitor hiding in the gloom, but I was alone. At least I thought I was. The only movement was slow, almost imperceptible sway of the roses in the cool night air. Yet the feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that refused, drawn inexplicably toward the small arbor. I stepped closer until I could see a single, weathered bench beneath a canopy of drooping branches. Resting on the bench was an object that made my heart catch, a single red rose, impossibly fresh against the backdrop of decay, its petals glistening with droplets of dew or perhaps something darker. I hesitated, unsure if I should pick it up, but an inner compulsion overrode my caution. When my fingers brushed against the soft petals, a wave of intense emotion, loss, longing, and a desperate plea washed over me. The silence of the garden suddenly shattered, with a sound like distant laughter mingled with soft sobs. I spun around, straining to locate its source. Among the dense shadows, I saw a figure emerge, a woman in a flowing, tattered gown, her face half hidden beneath a cascade of dark hair. Her eyes shone with an unearthly light, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though I were staring into the abyss of another lifetime. The spectral figure raised a trembling hand in greeting, her voice a mere breath carried on the wind. At last, you have come. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, yet I found myself rooted to the spot, drawn into the depths of her sorrow. I wanted to ask her who she was, why she lingered in this cursed place, but the words died on my. Instead, the garden seemed to come alive with memories, a chorus of voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand, the rustle of leaves echoing the beat of a broken heart. I sensed that this place was not merely a garden, but a mausoleum of lost love, a repository for souls condemned to wander in perpetual grief. The apparition began to move slowly toward me, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. As she drew nearer, I could see the pain etched across her ethereal features, a sorrow that had spanned decades, perhaps centuries. I was betrayed, each word carrying the weight of unutterable regret. My love was taken from me on a Valentine's Day, much like this, and ever since I have waited for someone to share. Her eyes bore into in that moment. I felt a connection so deep, profound, that it threatened to engulf me. I understood with a clarity that defied logic that her anguish was not hers alone. It was a mirror of every broken heart that had ever wandered these forgotten paths. As the night wore on, the garden's oppressive atmosphere deepened. The wind began to carry more voices, soft cries of despair, whispers of unfulfilled promises, and the rustling sound of countless secrets desperately trying to escape. I saw other shapes among the roses, fleeting silhouettes of lovers locked in eternal embrace, only to be torn apart by fate's relentless cruelty. Each apparition was a fragment of a story, a piece of a puzzle that spoke of love's dark underside, a love that, instead of healing, had cursed them to eternal mourning. The spectral woman reached out to me, her hand passing through mine with a chill that was both physical and spiritual. Join me, her tone at once inviting and heart-wrenchingly forlorn. Let your heart remember what it has forgotten. Let us mend the broken pieces together. In that moment, I realized that the envelope I had found was no accident. It was a summons, a call to bear witness to a love story that transcended time and to take on the burden of its sorrow. Torn between the instinct to run and the overwhelming need to understand, I found myself stepping further into the heart of the garden. Each step felt like a descent into a realm where the boundary between the living and the dead was blurred. I could almost feel the weight of every lost love pressing against me, a thousand unseen hands gripping my heart with icy fingers. The roses seemed to close in, their thorny branches twisting like skeletal arms around me, binding me to the fate of those who had come before. At the center of the garden, beneath a vast, ancient oak whose gnarled branches stretched like the arms of time itself, I discovered a small stone altar. Upon it lay a collection of trinkets, a locket, a dried petal, and a faded photograph of a smiling couple whose eyes hinted at secrets and sorrow. As I knelt before the altar, the spectral woman's voice echoed softly in my mind. Remember us. Free our souls from the eternal prison of loss. A sudden understanding dawned upon me. I was not merely a visitor to this cursed. I was meant to be its next guardian, its next keeper of memories. The realization was both a blessing and a curse. In freeing the souls that lingered here, I would also be bound to this place, my heart entwined with the legacy of shattered promises and unavenged love. The thought sent a shudder through me, but I knew there was no turning back. The garden had chosen me, and in its silent, relentless way, it had whispered the truth, that to love is to risk being broken, and to remember is to be forever haunted. In the final moments before dawn, as the first light crept over the horizon, and the spectral figures began to fade into the mists of memory, I sat before the stone altar, trembling yet resolute. I pressed the single red rose to my chest, feeling its pulse merge with my own. I understood now that this Valentine's night had been a passage, a transformation from a life of indifferent solitude into one burdened with an eternal, bittersweet memory. As I rose to leave the garden, I paused at the gate and glanced back one last time. In the distance, through the parting fog, I saw the spectral woman standing beneath the ancient oak, her eyes filled with a silent plea. With a heavy heart and a soul forever altered, I stepped back into the night, carrying with me the legacy of the forgotten garden, a legacy that would bind my heart to the eternal lament of lost love for as long as I lived. Even now, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear her voice on the breeze, a soft echo that reminds me of that fateful night, and I know that somewhere in the depths of that cursed garden, the memory of our hearts remains entwined, forever waiting forever mournful, and forever bound by the thorns of a love that refused to die. I never believed in love at first sight. Hell, I barely believed in love at all. But last Valentine's Day, something happened that changed everything. Not in a fairy tale way, not in a way anyone would envy. It was the kind of love story that didn't end with a kiss. It ended in something much, much darker. It started with a dream. On the night of February 13th, I had a vivid nightmare. I was in a dimly lit restaurant, sitting across from a woman I had never seen before. She was beautiful in a haunting way. Pale skin, dark hair, deep brown eyes that seemed almost black. She wore a red dress, elegant and flowing, like she had stepped out of another time. The candle between us flickered, casting long shadows across the table. I tried to speak, but no words came. She smiled. Then, in a whisper so soft it barely reached me, she said, "Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the Crimson Orchid. I've been waiting." I jolted awake, heart pounding. The Crimson Orchid was a high-end restaurant downtown. I had never been there, never even thought about it. It felt like a dream, nothing more. But something about it unsettled me. The way she had looked at me, the way her voice had lingered in my mind even after I woke. It was just a dream. That's what I told myself. And yet, the next evening, at exactly 8 p.m., I found myself standing outside the Crimson Orchid. The restaurant was nearly full. Couples clinking glasses over candlelight, the hum of soft conversation and music in the air. I felt ridiculous for being there, but something in my gut told me to go inside. The hostess greeted me with a smile. "Reservation?" I hesitated. I think someone might have made one for me." She glanced at the list and, to my shock, nodded. "Right this way, sir." A table was already set for two, the same one from my dream. I sat down, uneasy, scanning the room. It was an upscale place, and I felt out of place. Just as I was debating leaving, I smelled something faintly sweet, jasmine and something else, something metallic. "You're here." I turned. She stood beside me, wearing the same red dress from my dream. Her dark eyes locked onto mine as she slid into the seat across from me. I don't understand," I stammered. "You will," she said, her voice smooth as silk. She tilted her head slightly, studying me like I was something to be unraveled. "You came. That means you're ready." "Ready for what?" She smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was knowing. Like she held a secret I wasn't in on yet. "To remember," she said simply. My throat went dry. The waiter arrived, pouring us each a glass of deep red wine. Without breaking eye contact, she lifted hers and swirled it slowly before taking a sip. Hesitant, I did the same. The second the wine touched my tongue, my vision blurred. The restaurant flickered, the people around us distorted, their faces shifting, melting into something grotesque. The candle between us burned too bright, the flames stretching unnaturally high. I gripped the edge of the table, my breath coming fast. What's happening?" "You're waking up," she whispered. Pain shot through my skull. Memories that weren't mine, rushed in like a flood. A different time, a different life. Valentine's, decades ago. I saw myself, but I wasn't me. I was someone else, sitting at this very table with her. Her dress was the same, but the restaurant was different. Older, candlelit, filled with laughter and music from another era. We were in love, and then blood. So much blood. I saw my own hands covered in red, her body, motionless across the table, the gleam of a knife, the sound of her last breath. I had killed her. The memory hit me so hard, I nearly fell out of my chair. My vision snapped back to the present. The restaurant was normal again. The people were normal. The music played softly, but she was still there, watching, waiting. "You remember now," she said, voice gentle but laced with something dark. "You left me, and I waited. I waited through time, through death, through everything. And now you're here, just like I knew you'd be." I couldn't breathe. "This isn't possible. You're not real." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "I am, and so are you. But not for much longer." The candle between us flickered again, and the shadows stretched impossibly long. I tried to move, to pull away, but my body wouldn't listen. "I loved you," she murmured, her grip tightening. "I still do. But love isn't just about joy. It's about pain, about sacrifice." The walls of the restaurant seemed to close in. The air turned thick, suffocating. "You can't leave again," she whispered. My vision darkened. The last thing I heard before the world disappeared was her voice, soft and full of something terrible. "Happy Valentine." When I woke up, I wasn't in the restaurant. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. I was in a dimly lit room, candlelight flickering on the walls. A table was set for two, the wine glasses were full, and across from me, she sat, waiting, smiling. This time, I've always hated Valentine. The pressure, the expectations, the constant bombardment of hearts and flowers. None of it felt real to me. It always seemed like the world was telling you how to feel, how to love. I preferred the quieter days, the days that didn't come with a commercial price tag. But last year, everything changed. What I once thought was just a silly holiday became something far darker, something that would haunt me forever. It all started with an invitation. I had been working late, finishing up a project for my company, when I found a small red envelope sitting on my doorstep. There was no return address, no name, just an intricate heart embossed on the front. I thought it was strange, chalked it up to some sort of Valentine's Day gimmick or random promotional. I almost threw it away, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was the strange font of the writing on the envelope, the way it seemed to glow faint. So I opened it. Inside was a single card. Meet me at 7 p.m. The old theater on Oak Street. I've been waiting for you. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and the message sent a strange chill through. Who could have sent this? What old theater on Oak Street? I'd heard of it, but it had been abandoned for years, left to rot after a fire years. People said it was haunted, but I never paid much attention to rumors. That evening, I couldn't get the card out of my mind. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, that it was nothing more than a random invitation to get me to show up at some derelict building. But something in my gut told me it was more. I felt drawn to it. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. I arrived at the old theater just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the crumbling stone and ivy-covered walls. The place looked like something out of a nightmare, dark, dilapidated, and suffocating in its silence. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement, but the doors were slightly ajar, creaking as if inviting me inside. I stepped through, the musty smell of old wood and dust filling my nose. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. The sound felt too loud, too jarring in the stillness. The building seemed to groan under its own weight, as if it was barely holding on to its existence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky in the vast emptiness. There was no response. I wandered deeper into the theater, my heart pounding. I found my way to the main auditorium, where the faded velvet curtains still hung, their rich red color almost untouched, despite the years of decay. The stage was empty, but in the center of the room, there was a single chair facing the stage. And then I saw her. She was sitting in the chair, draped in a long black dress. Her hair was dark, cascading in waves down her back. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine, with a gaze that sent ice running through my veins. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice soft but sharp, like a whisper in the dark. "For so long." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen in place. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. She smiled, her lips curling in a way that didn't seem right. It was too wide, too eerie, like she knew something I didn't. "I'm the one you've been running from." I took a step back, my pulse racing. "What do you mean?" "You've been running from this night for years," she continued, her voice growing colder, more distant. "But it's always been waiting. Every February 14th, the day you ignored me, the day you let me go. I've been waiting, watching, and now it's time for you to face the consequence." I took another step back, trying to make sense of her words, but the fear was suffocating. She hadn't told me who she was, but I was starting to realize that I knew exactly. It was her, the girl I had broken up with years ago, the one I had promised I would love forever, the one I had left on Valentine's Day without a second thought. I had moved on, married someone else, and shoved her out of my mind. But now, it seemed like she hadn't forgotten. She had never let me. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with a strange, suffocating presence. "You can't leave," she said softly, almost tenderly. "Not now. Not after everything." I spun around, only to find that she was gone. The chair was empty, but her voice, that whispering, chilling voice, echoed in my ears. "You didn't love me, but I loved you. I still do, and you will never leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The room began to spin, the walls contorting and twisting, becoming something monstrous. Shadows moved like living things, creeping toward me. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I was trapped, alone. I stumbled forward, trying to find the door, but it was as if the building itself was alive, shifting and changing, trapping me inside. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were breathing. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt something cold brush against my neck. Her breath. Her voice was in my ear now, soft and menacing. "Happy Valentine's Day." The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up the next morning, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I looked around. I was in my apartment. The sun was shining through the window, peaceful and normal. But I knew it wasn't just a dream. It couldn't be. I checked my phone. There was one unread message. "I'll be waiting, same time, same place, forever." I couldn't escape. I never believed in the supernatural. I thought ghosts were just stories, and curses were for the naive. I lived a normal life, always grounded in logic and reason. But last Valentine's Day, my world turned upside down, and I realized just how wrong I had been. It all started with an old box. I had recently moved into an old apartment building in the city, one that had seen better days. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the elevator was out of service more often than not. But the price was right, and I didn't mind the quirky, faded charm of it. I hadn't planned on staying for long, but life had a way of surprising me. One evening, as I was unpacking some old boxes I had brought from my childhood home, I found something buried beneath a stack of old books. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns I didn't recognize. The lid was slightly ajar, and inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Curiosity piqued. I opened the note. It was written in a delicate, looping script. To the one who dares to open this box, you have unknowingly unlocked a curse. Every year on Valentine's Day, someone will come for you. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, you will be hunted. The only way to survive is to give them your heart. But be warned, you may never escape. My heart skipped a beat. It felt like a joke, a cruel prank from a past tenant. But as I laughed nervously, something in me told me to get rid of the box, to burn it, throw it away. But I didn't. I didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that there might be truth in those words. The next morning, I threw the box into the back of my closet and tried to forget about it. I was determined not to let my imagination run wild. The world was a logical place, and I had no time for nonsense. But the next night, February 13th, I started hearing things. Small noises like tapping at my window, scratching at the walls. At first I thought it was just the building settling, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. And then I saw it. I was sitting on my couch, trying to focus on a movie when the lights flicked. The air in the room grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. Froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The figure stepped into the room, slowly, deliberately, its footsteps echoing on the floor. It was a woman. She was dressed in a long black dress, her face obscured by a veil. She moved like a shadow, gliding silently across the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what was happening. Who? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her dress and pulled out a small, ornate, her eyes hidden behind, never left me. I've come for, voice soft and chilling. It's time. I stumbled back, my mind trying to process the absurdity of the situation. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But then the words from the note flashed in my mind. Someone will come for you. I ran. I bolted for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could hear her moving around me, the sound of her footsteps in the shadows. My breath quickened, and panic set in. I had to get out. I had to escape. I tried the window. It was locked. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the coldness of her presence behind me. Why are you doing this? I screamed. What do you want from me? Her laugh was low and hollow. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to claim what you promised. My chest tightened as the words hit me like a physical blow. I tried to turn around, but my body felt like it was moving in slow motion. My legs wouldn't cooperate. She was behind me now, too close, her breath cold against my ear. And then she whispered, "Your heart." I didn't understand. I didn't know what she... But then I remembered the box, the note. I had unlocked something terrible, and now it was too late. I had made a mistake, a terrible, deadly mistake, and there was no way out. The next thing I knew, I woke up on the floor, my head spinning. The apartment was still dark, the air heavy with silence. I was alone, but something was wrong, very wrong. I reached up to touch my chest, my hand trembling, and that's when I felt it, the absence, the emptiness. It was like a hole in my chest, where my heart should have been. I gasped, my mind racing as I realized the horror of what had just happened. I was alive, but not truly alive. The woman had taken my heart, literally and figuratively, and I knew she would be back, every year, on Valentine's Day. She would come for what she had left behind, and I would never escape. I couldn't outrun her. I couldn't hide. I had given her my heart, and I had no choice but to face her again, year after year. And the worst part? I could still hear her voice in my head, faint but clear. Happy Valentine's Day.